They say that grief is a process, a gradual fading of the sharp edges of loss into a dull, manageable ache. But here, inside the limestone walls of Blackwood Manor, grief does not fade. It thickens. It hangs in the air, a physical weight that presses against your lungs, tasting of stale pipe tobacco and the cloying, sickly sweet perfume of decaying lilies. It has been 3 weeks since we lowered father into the family crypt. 3 weeks of polite condolences and hushed whispers, yet the house feels as though it is still holding its breath, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I found myself drawn to the West Wing library, not out of sentimental longing, but out of a restless, gnawing necessity. Officially, my presence there was practical. As the executor, it was my duty to appraise the literary collection before the inevitable estate sale. But we lie to ourselves so easily, don't we? The truth was far less administrative. I was there because of an itch, a prickling sensation at the base of my neck that whispered that something in this house was misaligned. The silence in the West Wing was absolute, a heavy, velvet blanket of quiet that seemed to absorb the weak, gray light filtering through the leaded glass windows. Outside, the autumn rain had begun to fall, a relentless, scratching rhythm against the pain that sounded like fingernails trying to claw their way inside. The library was a cavernous room, lined from floor to ceiling with dark mahogany shelves that smelled of beeswax and old paper. It was a room designed for shadows. I walked the perimeter, my heels creating a rhythmic creak-step creak on the parquet floor, a sound that echoed too loudly in the emptiness. I ran my gloved fingers along the spines of the book's leather-bound histories, crumbling encyclopedias, first editions that had not been opened in decades. They felt cold to the touch, like sleeping things that resented the disturbance. I stopped in front of the history section. It was the darkest corner of the room, tucked away from the fireplace. Standing there, staring at the rows of forgotten wars and fallen empires, a memory surfaced timid and vivid. I was 10 years old again, playing Castle Siege with Arthur. We would scour the house for secret passages, tapping on the walls, convinced that the Blackwood legacy included hidden priest holes or treasure rooms. We never found anything back then, of course, just solid oak and disappointment. On a whim, born of that same childish instinct, I raised my hand, I curled my fingers into a fist, and tapped the paneling between the shelves. Thud, thud, thud. The sound was dull, flat, solid oak against brick, the sound of reality. I moved 2 feet to the left, toward the section housing the oversized atlases, great monolithic books that required 2 hands to lift. The rain outside intensified, lashing against the glass, drumming a chaotic tempo that matched the sudden acceleration of my heartbeat. I didn't know why I was doing this. It was absurd. I was a 60-year-old woman tapping on walls like a bored child. I tapped again. Thud, thud, dot, and then dot, 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 K-tunk. I froze. The sound changed instantly. It wasn't the dead, flat reject of solid wood. It was a hollow, resonant vibration that seemed to travel up my arm and echo in my chest. It was the sound of empty space, where no empty space should be. My breath hitched. I stripped off my gloves, needing to feel the wood with my bare skin. I traced the intricate molding of the bookshelf, my fingertips hunting for an imperfection, a seam, anything. The wood was smooth, polished by generations of housekeepers, but there, hidden within the carved acanthus leaf detailing, was a knot in the wood that felt warm, loose. I pressed it, with a sharp, mechanical click that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. The heavy bookshelf groaned. It swung outward on silent, well-oiled hinges, revealing a rush of cold air that smelled distinctively of dry rot and secrets. It was a scent that had been sealed away for years. Stagnant and heavy. Inside the small, dust-free alcove sat a single object, Father's gray, lockbox. My stomach turned over. It was the steel box Arthur had sworn was empty. He had stood in the parlor, tears streaming down his face, and told me he had checked it himself. He told me there was nothing left. My hands trembled as I reached into the darkness and pulled the heavy box into the light. It was cold, the metal biting into my palms. I knew where the key was. It was a secret Father had shared only with me, a little ritual we had. Hell is locked from the inside, Martha, he used to say. I walked to the poetry section and pulled down Dante's Inferno. The spine crackled as I opened it. There, nestled in the hollowed-out binding, was the small brass key. I inserted it into the lockbox. The mechanism turned with a smooth, fluid resistance. I lifted the lid, There was no money, no jewelry, just a single envelope of heavy cream vellum resting on blue velvet. I recognized the wax seal immediately. I unfolded the document, the paper crisp and authoritative. It was the last will and testament, but the date at the top was from just 2 days before Father died. I read the first paragraph, and the floor seemed to drop out from under me. This was not the draft Arthur had read to the lawyers. This was not the document that left the estate in Arthur's care for the preservation of the legacy. This was entirely different. Arthur had told me he burned the old drafts to protect the family from Father's dementia-ridden changes. He had held my hand and wept about the burden of leadership, but looking at the sharp, lucid signature at the bottom of the page, the horrifying clarity of the situation washed over me. Arthur hadn't burned this to protect the family. He had buried it to protect himself. And if he was willing to lie about the will, looking me in the eye while he did it, I had to ask myself the terrifying question that now clawed at my throat. What exactly happened in this room 2 days before Father died? I collapsed into the oxblood leather wingback chair, the air leaving my lungs in a ragged, shuddering gasp. The vellum document in my lap felt impossibly heavy, as if the weight of the ink itself were dragging me down into the earth. Outside, the storm had deepened, the daylight strangled by heavy charcoal clouds, casting the library into a premature twilight. I didn't reach for the lamp. I didn't want light. I wanted to disappear into the upholstery, to become as inanimate and silent as the books surrounding me. I forced my eyes to the page. I needed to see the madness Arthur had spoken of. I needed to see the wandering, incoherent scribbles of a mind eaten away by dementia. That was the narrative we had been sold. The story that had justified everything. But the text before me was not the rambling of a senile man. It was razor-sharp. The handwriting was Father's, spiky, aggressive, and utterly lucid. The phrasing was precise, devoid of the sentimental clutter that usually accompanies decline. It was a legal scalpel. The will didn't just detail the distribution of assets. It contained a confession, or rather, an accusation. Paragraph 3, written in a steady hand, outlined a forensic dismantling of Arthur's life. It detailed unauthorized withdrawals from the family trust dating back 5 years, amounts, and account numbers. To my son, Arthur, the document read, the words swimming before my stinging eyes, who has mistaken my silence for ignorance. I leave you nothing but the opportunity for redemption. You are disinherited from this estate until every cent stolen from the trust is repaid with interest. Until then, the entirety of the Blackwood fortune falls to Martha, whom I charge with the liquidation of assets to settle the debts you have secretly accrued. My hand flew to my mouth to stifle a sob. It wasn't dementia. It was discipline. Father hadn't lost his mind. He had been silently building a case. The revelation triggered a memory so visceral it made the room spin. I was suddenly pulled back in time. 3 weeks ago, the night of the fire, I could feel the phantom heat of the living room hearth on my face, a suffocating, dry warmth that made my skin prickle. I saw Arthur standing by the limestone mantel, his silhouette framed by the roaring orange glow. He was holding a sheaf of papers, his knuckles white against the dark wood. I remembered the sound of the fire, not a cozy crackle, but a hungry, snapping sound, like a beast chewing on bone. But it was the smell that choked me now. Beneath the aroma of burning hickory, there had been a sharper, chemical lighter fluid. It had been pungent, masking the scent of the woods. At the time, I hadn't questioned it. I was too wrapped in the fog of fresh grief. In the memory, Arthur turned to me. His face was flushed, sweat beading on his upper lip, his eyes wide and glistening with tears. But looking back now, through the lens of this damning document, those weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of panic. I'm doing this for us, Martha, he had said, his voice trembling with a manufactured vibrato. Dad wasn't in his right mind. You saw him at the end. He wanted to give it all to that scam charity in Zurich. He was going to leave us destitute. I'm burning the mistake. I'm protecting the legacy. I had nodded. God help me. I had nodded. I had watched him toss the papers into the hungry mouth of the fireplace. I had watched the edges curl and blacken, the ink vanishing into ash. I had felt a wave of complicity, believing I was helping him save our family from the whims of a dying man. But he hadn't burned the will. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Arthur had burned a decoy. He had staged a piece of theater for an audience of one, knowing I would be too grief-stricken to check the documents he was destroying. But why keep the real one? Why hide it here, in the library, instead of shredding it? The answer came to me with a chilling clarity as I stared at the gray lockbox. Arthur was a hoarder, not of things, but of leverage. He couldn't bring himself to destroy the only proof of his crime. Perhaps he feared that without the document, he would forget the specific legal clauses he needed to navigate around. Or perhaps it was something darker, a trophy, a reminder of the bullet he had dodged. He kept it because he was arrogant enough to believe that no one, certainly not his spinster sister, would ever be smart enough to look for it. Crunch. The sound shattered my focus. It was the distinct, grinding noise of tires rolling over the gravel driveway. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, bruising the inside of my chest. I glanced at the grandfather clock in the corner. It was barely 4 o'clock. Arthur wasn't supposed to be back from the city until dinner. A car door slammed. The heavy, muffled thud reverberated through the thick stone walls of the manor. Panic, cold and sharp, flooded my veins. I scrambled up from the chair, the will clutched in my hand. I looked at the bookshelf. It was still swung open, the hidden cavity yawning like an open mouth. I rushed over, shoving the lockbox back into the alcove. I grabbed the edge of the shelf and pushed. It swung shut with a click. But as I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. The layer of dust on the floor where the shelf had moved, was smeared. The tracks of my shoes were visible in the gray film. And the books. I hadn't aligned them perfectly. The history section looked disturbed, the spines jutting out unevenly compared to the pristine alignment of the rest of the room. Footsteps echoed in the foyer. Heavy, confident strides. Clack, clack, clack. Then, a sound that made my blood run cold. Whistling. Arthur was whistling. It was a cheerful, discordant tune, bouncing off the marble floors of the entryway. It was the sound of a man who believed he was safe, a man who owned the world and everything in it. Martha. His voice boomed, closer than I expected. I saw the lights on in the West Wing. You working hard or hardly working? The footsteps stopped. He was just outside the double doors. I was trapped in the room with the proof of his felony, holding the paper that could send him to prison, and I realized with a terrifying finality that the brother I loved didn't exist. The man standing on the other side of that door was a stranger wearing my brother's face. The brass handle of the library door began to turn. The heavy mahogany door swung inward, bringing with it a gust of hallway air that disrupted the stagnant, dust-mote atmosphere of the library. Arthur stood framed in the doorway, his silhouette backlit by the sconces in the corridor. He looked every inch, the lord of the manor-tailored charcoal suit, collar unbuttoned to reveal a sliver of pale neck, a crystal tumbler of amber liquid, loosely gripped in his right hand. I had tried to shove the bookcase shut. I had pushed it with all the frantic strength my panic could muster. But the universe, it seemed, had a cruel sense of comedic timing. The ancient brass latch, worn smooth by decades of disuse, failed to catch. Just as Arthur stepped across the threshold, a low, mournful groan echoed behind me. The hidden panel drifted open, swinging wide like a gaping mouth screaming his guilt to the room. The whistling died in his throat. It didn't taper off. It was severed, replaced instantly by a silence so profound I could hear the bubbles sizzling in his glass of scotch. Arthur didn't gasp. He didn't drop the glass. He simply stood there, his eyes flicking from the yawning black hole in the wall to the sheaf of vellum clutched against my chest. His expression shifted from casual arrogance to a flat, terrifying neutrality. He took a sip of his drink, the ice clinking softly, a sound that felt violently loud in the quiet. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he reached behind him, found the brass key in the lock, and turned it. Click. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home vibrated through the floorboards and into the soles of my feet. I told you not to play in the library, Martha, he said softly. His voice was dangerously calm, devoid of the jagged edges of panic I had expected. It was the voice he used when scolding a servant or dismissing a waiter. You always were too curious for your own good. My heart was hammering against my ribs, a frantic bird trying to cage break. But my hands, surprisingly, were steady. I held the last will and testament up, the paper rustling like dry leaves. You didn't burn it, I whispered, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the cavernous room. You stood there and wept. Arthur, you made me hold your hand while you threw papers into the fire. But you didn't burn it. You stole it. You stole everything. Arthur sighed a long, disappointed exhalation through his nose. He walked further into the room, his shoes sinking into the Persian rug. Stole is such a pedestrian word, Martha, I salvaged. Do you have any idea what the old man had done? The impulsive investments, the chaotic donations to foundations that don't exist. The trust was bleeding out. He took another step, his face twisting into a mask of martyred frustration. I didn't take the money for yachts and villas. I took it to plug the holes in the ship he was sinking. I saved this family. I saved you. If I hadn't moved those funds, we'd be selling this house to pay off his debts. Liar. The word ripped out of me, sharp and jagged. I read the document. Arthur, father knew. He knew about the skimming for 5 years. This wasn't damage control. It was I took a step back as he advanced, the distance between us shrinking. The air around him reeked of expensive single malt scotch and a cloying, musky cologne, the scent of a man who masked his rot with luxury. I watched you cry. I screamed, the betrayal burning hotter than fear. I handed you the matches. Do you know what you did to me? You didn't just commit a crime. You made me an accomplice to a fraud. You made me a party to desecrating our father's dying wish. Arthur's mask finally slipped. The cool, aristocratic veneer cracked, revealing a sneer of pure, unfiltered, ugly entitlement. He slammed his glass down on a side table, the liquid splashing onto the polished wood. "Oh, grow up, Martha," he barked, closing the gap. He was in my personal space now, towering over me. I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes, the sweat beading on his forehead. "Give me the paper. It's just us. The doors are locked. The staff are in the East Wing. Nobody has to know." He held out a hand, palm up, fingers twitching. "We burn it now. For real this time. In the grate, we watch it turn to ash, and then we split the money. 50-50. You can go to Paris. You can buy that gallery you always droned on about. Just ... Don't be a martyr. Martyrs end up dead and forgotten." He lunged. It wasn't a strike, but a grab, a desperate clawing for the vellum. I anticipated it. Adrenaline, cold and electric, flooded my system. I sidestepped, scrambling backward until the heavy oak executive desk was between us. It was a massive piece of furniture, a fortress of carved wood. "Give it to me, Martha," he roared, leaning over the leather surface, his face contorted. "No," I said. My voice was different now. The tremble was gone. "It's too late for deals, Arthur." I reached into the pocket of my cardigan. I didn't pull out a weapon. I pulled out my phone. I held the screen up so he could see it. The white glow illuminated the darkness of the library. On the screen, the voice memo app was open. The red waveform was pulsing rhythmically, reacting to his shouting. The timer read for 12. "I haven't just been reading," I said, my voice steady, cutting through his rage like a blade. "I've been recording since the moment I found the box. Every lie, every threat, every offer to split the stolen money. It's all here." Arthur froze. He looked at the phone as if it were a loaded gun. The color drained from his face, leaving him a pale waxen gray. "And," I continued, pressing the advantage, "I didn't just sit here waiting for you. I texted Mr. Henderson the moment I verified the signature. I sent him a photo of the confession clause. He replied 2 minutes ago." Arthur blinked, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The physical threat evaporated, replaced instantly by the crushing, suffocating weight of legal reality. He wasn't looking at a sister he could bully anymore. He was looking at a witness he couldn't silence. "He's already on the driveway, Arthur," I said softly, as if on cue. The heavy silence of the estate was punctured by a sound from the outside world. Through the rain-lashed windows, headlights swept across the library ceiling. The distinct, gravel-crunching sound of a heavy car braking hard in front of the portico echoed through the walls. Arthur slumped against the doorframe of the library, all the air leaving his body. The arrogance, the height, the power, it all dissolved. He looked small, defeated, ruined. But then, as the heavy brass knocker slammed against the front door downstairs, echoing through the house like the gavel of a judge, Arthur looked up. His eyes weren't filled with remorse. They were filled with a sudden, chilling calculation. He looked at the phone in my hand, then at the fire poker resting by the hearth. "Henderson is old," Arthur whispered, a strange, disjointed smile touching his lips. "It would take him at least 5 minutes to get the spare key from the caretaker. That's a lot of time, Martha. A lot of time for an accident. The library is no longer a sanctuary. It has been violated by the crude, strobing rhythm of the modern world. Through the leaded glass windows, the rotating blue lights of the police cruisers cut through the gloom, painting the mahogany shelves in violent, unnatural flashes of azure and shadow. The warm, amber embrace of the room has been shattered, replaced by this cold, pulsing cadence of the law. I stood by the window, my breath fogging the cold glass, watching the scene unfold on the gravel driveway below. It was a silent film of ruin. Mr. Henderson, our family attorney, stood like a sentinel by the black sedan, his umbrella shielding him from the relentless rain. He wasn't holding Arthur's arm. Arthur was not in handcuffs. Not yet, but the way Henderson shadowed him, the rigid set of his shoulders, spoke of a custody far stricter than steel links. Arthur walked with a strange, disjointed gait, as if he had forgotten how his legs worked. He didn't look back at the house. He didn't look up at the window where he knew I was watching. He simply stared at the wet gravel, his shoulders hunched against the downpour, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. The grandiose villain who had threatened me only an hour ago had dissolved, leaving behind a terrified, hollow man in a damp charcoal suit. As he slid into the backseat of the car, I realized with a pang of complicated grief that I wasn't just watching my brother leave. I was watching the last remnant of my childhood being driven away into the dark. The car doors slammed a final, muffled thud that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. The engine purred to life, and the taillights faded into the storm. Two red eyes blinking shut in the distance. I turned back to the room. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was terrifying. Usually, Blackwood Manor is a symphony of settling wood. It groans, it creaks, it whispers with the thermal shifts of the night. But now, the house was dead silent. It felt as though the very timber and stone were holding their breath, stunned by the violence of the revelation. My eyes were drawn, inevitably, to the open wound in the room. The secret panel in the bookcase still stood ajar, a dark, gaping mouth in the wall. The history section and the atlases were skewed, disjointed, revealing the raw brick and the dusty alcove behind them. I walked over to the desk where the will lay. I touched the heavy cream vellum. I had thought that finding this document would bring me peace. I had thought it would be a communion with Father, a way to hear his voice one last time. But as I traced the sharp, aggressive strokes of his signature, I realized the truth was far colder. Father hadn't hidden this will to protect the money. He hadn't hidden it to spare us pain. He had hidden it to test us. He knew us. He knew us better than we knew ourselves. He knew Arthur's greed was a bottomless pit, a hunger that would eventually drive him to search every corner of the estate for more. And he knew me. He knew my nostalgia, my sentimental attachment to the castle siege games of our youth. He knew that eventually, when the silence of the house became too much to bear, I would come looking for the ghosts in the walls. He had set a trap. He had placed the bait in the one place Arthur would never look, a book, and the key in the one place only I would remember. It wasn't a legal document. It was a moral exam. And tonight, we had both finally turned in our papers. Arthur had failed, and I was left with the prize, which felt less like a victory and more like a burden. I was the sole custodian of a broken legacy. My hand brushed against a cold, metallic object on the desk. It was Arthur's lighter, the silver Zippo he had left behind in his panic. I picked it up. It was heavy, cool to the touch, smelling faintly of flint and expensive butane. I flipped the lid open with a sharp clink. I struck the wheel. The flame erupted instantly, a perfect, unwavering tongue of orange fire. I stared at the will. I stared at the flame. For a heartbeat, a long, suspended second that stretched into eternity, the temptation was overwhelming. I could burn it. I could do what Arthur had tried to do. I could hold the vellum to the flame and watch the confession, the debts, and the betrayal curl into black ash. I could erase the last hour. I could tell the police it was a misunderstanding. I could save Arthur. I could save the family name from the scandal that was about to engulf us. It would be so easy, just a tilt of the wrist, and the truth would vanish into smoke, leaving us with the comfortable lies we had lived with for so long. The heat of the flame kissed my thumb. The fire danced in the reflection of the dark window, mesmerizing and seductive. It promised oblivion. It promised a return to the status quo. But then, I looked at the empty space in the bookshelf. I looked at the dark void where the truth had been waiting for 3 weeks, patient and rot-proof. I snapped the lid shut. The flame died instantly, choked off from its oxygen. The sharp smell of extinguished wick filled the space between us. I placed the lighter down on the desk, right next to the phone. "The truth burns hotter than fire," I whispered to the empty room. My voice didn't echo. It was absorbed by the books, by the history, by the walls that had seen everything. I picked up the receiver to call the executor. As I dialed, I took a deep breath. The air in the library, which had been thick with dust and deception for so many years, suddenly felt sharp. It was cold, yes, and it smelled of rain and wet earth. but for the first time in as long as I could remember, it was BREATHABLE. Secrets have a way of surfacing, don't they? If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to my channel. I have many more locked away in this library. Waiting for you.